Hello. So we've got, in theory, just 4 days left to go at COP27 in Egypt. So it's coming to crunch time for a lot of the negotiations, but so much work still to be done, as ever seems to be the case with the COPs. They always go to the last minute, and usually over the last minute into the final weekend. But some snapshots, I guess, from where things are and what's going on. So we've had, as ever, also at COPs, lots of really important new assessments, new reports coming out to inform the negotiations, to set context. One of the major ones just in the last few days has been from the Global Carbon Project. So the Global Carbon Project are a group of scientists from around the world who do an amazing job actually analysing all of the data in terms of emissions, all of the models in terms of energy use from different countries, to give us a view on how we're doing in terms of global carbon dioxide emissions. They also cover methane and other greenhouse gases as well. So their latest report came out and indicates an increase in emissions this year in 2022, a slight increase, about 1%. That is part of a kind of, I guess, a trend over the last few years. If you take the dip away from the big lockdowns in 2020, and some of the lockdowns obviously ongoing in 2021, essentially we've gone back to obviously unsustainable emissions. Emissions should be coming down, and they aren't. But there are some signs within their report that some nations are investing heavily in renewables and trying to move away from fossil fuels. But the short-term picture seems to be ongoing unsustainable carbon emissions from that important report. If we take then what's going on at COP27 and the discussions there, and some of the key strands of negotiations. So one that we knew was going to be important right from the early days of COP27 last week was this issue of loss and damage. So the impacts of climate change that you can't mitigate away by cutting emissions or adapt to. The negative impacts that are already happening and are going to keep happening with increased severity. The negotiations on that issue obviously are really fraught. You've got rich nations in the north who don't want to be counted liable for all their historic emissions in terms of the kind of liability, financial liability. But the reality that people, livelihoods, countries are being hit by those emissions and the resulting warming. So at least there are negotiations going on, and they're focused on a financial mechanism. How do you actually direct finance, pay for things like insurance for farmers who might lose their crops, or householders, etc., who are suffering loss and damage from climate change? There's a few draft texts on the table already around loss and damage, looking at the kind of timelines for putting this financial mechanism into place. There's a suggestion that the United Nations would run it, would facilitate that financial mechanism, and the timelines looking at, well, a couple of years to put that in place. But that's still a draft text and a lot to be negotiated on that front. So good luck to the negotiators, who I know are working really hard on that issue from around the world. Yeah, all power to your arms. Some of the other things which have been going on during this last few days at COP include a lot of discussions actually outside of the formal negotiations. So one of the big issues that we saw progress on at COP26 was around carbon markets and trading. But one of the things that was resolved, I guess, one of the big things was the voluntary carbon market. So there was a rule book, essentially the Paris rule book on carbon trading, so a thing called Article 6 in the Paris Agreement, which covered the kind of trading of carbon between nations and what's called the compliance market. But obviously there's this really big market, the voluntary market. If you're a business wanting to offset your emissions, if you're going on a flight, you might buy carbon credits. That's all under the voluntary carbon market in the main. And that's a market which potentially could mean lots of money, lots of finance goes into good projects for cutting emissions. The issue with that is actually the regulation of it, the rules around it, the safeguards are nowhere near as robust as they should be. So there's been a lot of focus on that at the COPs and in between them. And right now, it's a key thing which will help underpin a lot of the subnational, so kind of the business and community and city commitments on climate change. And there's a thing called the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative, which is a bit of a mouthful, but the work they are doing is crucial in terms of setting up the rules, the guidance that everyone can follow when using the voluntary carbon market, and actually giving that some assurance, if you're an investor, if you're one of us paying for a carbon credit, that actually it meets some key rules, some key, it has some key safeguards. So they include things like additionality. Would it have happened anyway? If it would have happened anyway, then you're not really helping the climate. Does it address leakage? So that's if we have a carbon mitigation project somewhere like growing a forest, but all that does is mean the kind of deforestation is just exacerbated down the road. So it's called carbon leakage. So the carbon still gets emitted to the atmosphere. There's the question of permanence. So if we are using the voluntary carbon market to get carbon out of the atmosphere or stop it being emitted, so avoidance or removals, as it's called, either way, that needs to be permanent in terms of what the climate sees. So it needs to be many decades, ideally centuries or even millennia, to keep that CO2 from the atmosphere. And really importantly, with this voluntary carbon market, just like the kind of the compliance markets, or the formal one, the social and nature safeguards. So are we potentially financing carbon mitigation projects which damage livelihoods, which disenfranchise communities which actually rely on those, particularly in terms of land use on those bits of land? Are we damaging biodiversity for the sake of carbon? And so actually getting a really negative trade-off there. So that's a really important context for some of the discussions, yes, this week at COP, but actually more generally in terms of that voluntary carbon market area. A couple of other things just to flag up, again, related to COP, but they're things which are going on outside of the official negotiation text. So one of the things that we saw at COP26 was the Just Energy Transition Partnership with South Africa. So led by the US and the EU in that case, to help South Africa transition away from coal primarily, but to do that in a fair way, so actually support livelihoods, investment in new jobs, low carbon industries, to make it stickable in the South African economy, so that actually that was will be a just energy transition is the plan. Now that initiative at COP26 very quickly led to Indonesia, another major emitter, particularly around land use, but also through fossil fuel burning, so coal for power, and Indonesia is a big source of emissions. Discussions with Indonesia have been going on ever since COP26 about a just energy transition partnership with Indonesia, this time again led by the US, but Japan being a key partner in this, and looking again at big investment, around $2 billion, to make that transition to low carbon economy much faster and much more stickable in terms of societal acceptance, things like livelihoods and moving away from coal. So basically retiring coal fired power stations early, which Indonesia would need help with from rich countries, and that's not just public funds, but that's also private investors as well, investing in through loans that decarbonisation to help the just energy transition. So that model is an exciting one. If it can work, it could be a way for finance to flow, all right, not in a big kind of all the global north giving money for projects, but actually in these multilateral ways or even bilateral ways, actually seeing progress within particular countries. So that is a model that hopefully will prove successful and can be built on for the coming years. A couple of other things just to cover. So we've had some more detail at COP27 in terms of some of the national climate plans that different countries have announced. No big new commitments in terms of pledges to cut emissions, unfortunately, but like I say, some more detail. So India, for instance, have fleshed out their proposals a fair bit more. Really interesting with India is they put in quite a lot of emphasis on individual behaviours, individual actions to tackle climate change. So everything from dietary choice to energy use. So that's quite notable in terms of India's kind of climate change plans. As we know from all around the world where we've got those elements in a lot of national plans, it all has to be within a system-wide approach. So it has to be facilitated, it has to be affordable. And so that's the big challenge for India to pull off, is to do that in a way which does empower individuals to take the action that they're kind of projecting in their plans. I'll finish up with thinking about what we might see this week, and hopefully for the negotiators and all the delegates in Egypt, they won't have to wait until Sunday before there's a final text, or even Monday. Hopefully it won't overrun. It should be drawing to a close at the end of this week. What will be in the final text? The Egypt Pact or Accord, or whatever it's called, the Sharm el-Sheikh Pact or Accord. We can expect some, I think, some more kind of positive words about phasing down fossil fuels. So we saw that really contentious bit in the Glasgow Climate Pact around phasing down coal rather than phasing out coal, and a lot of a kind of friction between nations about that wording. There has been a call for the final text from Sharm to include a commitment to phase down all fossil fuels, so including oil and gas, but that's controversial in, obviously, for states like a lot of the Middle Eastern states where oil is really important to their economies. So we'll see if that stays in. We've seen some really good signs just the last 24 hours in terms of the world's biggest economies and the biggest emitters. So that is the US and China, talking again on climate change. And actually some of the relationships seem to be thawing again. Obviously it's wrapped up in a lot of other politics, but that was really good news for the negotiations in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, and hopefully will strengthen this this final text that comes out of COP27. One of the things to look out for is going to be any reference to the 1.5 warming goal. So the warming goal, which is in the Paris Agreement in terms of an ambition to limit global average temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius during this century. There seems to be some backsliding from some nations in terms of whether that should remain in. It's becoming physically really challenging to do because our emissions aren't going down anywhere near as fast as they would need to. So we'll see if that remains in the text and remains an aim. I think if it isn't, and if progress is not made at COP27 in terms of further emission reductions and a plan to deliver those, then 1.5 will probably get its kind of death certificate at the end of this COP. So a huge amount to play for in terms of the negotiators there. Some reasons to be positive in terms of progress on things like loss and damage by the look of it, but certainly it's going to need all the best efforts of US and China as key economies, but all of the negotiators and delegates there to hopefully bring us something where we can say 1.5 is still alive just at the end of COP27. Thank you.